All right, we are recording.
Excellent. We are working on having finished the U.S. Constitution last week, we are working on the amendments to the Constitution of the United States, and wrapped in that is obviously the Bill of Rights, being
Yes.
the first 10 amendments. So, um, I think I wanted to start with sort of a question because I mean, obviously, I don't think we're gonna cover all 27. I
No.
don't think we need to cover all 27 amendments, but I do think that whichever ones we cover are going to um, deal with interpretive matters.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that just sort of like a brief approach to interpreting the Constitution and by extension the amendments is sort of important. So if just bear with me as I run through some of these, and we can sort of talk about these before we get into it. Um, so these are just the little research I did, different modes of interpreting the Constitution and amendments. So there's textualism, and textualism is really, I mean, it's in the word, right? So it's working with the text of the document, and those that buy into that mode of interpretation are basically arguing that. The way to understand the Constitution is to understand the plain meaning of the text as understood by the framers. So this has a historical component. Um, the distinction here, though, between the next one I'm going to talk about is that intention doesn't matter. It's literally just the what the text says. So there's sort of bracketing intention of the authors,
Okay, and does
but
that
how the
count as like in the context of the time of that language too?
yes, yes,
Okay.
exactly, totally. So the next one, which is the originalist, is similar to the textualist, um, but it's on the text of the document, the plain meaning, as the framers understood it. The other distinction, though, is that intention does matter. So what were they intending? Sort of like the psychological component. What were they intending by creating this particular amendment or stating what they're stating?
Mm-hmm.
Um, So originalist intention, not just the text, textualist, just the text. Um, After that, there's judicial precedent. And when we start looking at uh, the Supreme Court cases after the Federalist Papers, we'll see a lot of that come about. And that's basically however the courts have decided cases in the past. That, and I should say, none of these are necessarily mutually exclusive. My reading sort of bore out that at times the Supreme Court justices and other justices in lower courts have used sort of a mix.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine though that maybe some aren't compatible among this list, but anyway, so judicial precedent, basically how the court has decided cases in the past that then without it being like ratified into the document ends up being incorporated into interpreting the document, right? Um, so that's you can sort of see like by accretion all those decisions. Then you're looking back at the document through those decisions,
Mm-hmm.
and those decisions are, oh my God, immense, right? A lot of
Right.
cases have been tried. One that's sort of pretty different than the first three is pragmatism. And so with pragmatism, and it should be noted that the first three, so textualism, originalism, and uh, judicial precedent, don't really look at the consequences. Um, so, in other words, by deciding a case this way or by interpreting the document this way, what will the result be? What will the world look like? What will people be granted? What will be taken away? So the pragmatic approach is really looking at sort of a cost benefit analysis and looking at the pros and cons of a particular interpretation. So that's probably the most, uh, yeah, of the four, pretty distinct, right? Because the first three are not doing that.
Hmm.
Then there's moral reasoning. You could see how this sort of could really be used with any of them, but the moral reasoning would be honing in on particular moral terms within the text or using moral reasoning to understand the text.
Hmm.
So that's, terms like equal protection or due process of the law have a moral connotation. And so it allows then or opens the door for moral deliberation. And that whole area of moral reasoning is a massive area. I've taught some of it in the past in ethics courses where you're using reasoning, but you're using reasoning with value terms. The next one is national identity or ethos. So national identity really deals with looking at the nation's character. So how is the United States distinct in its history and its current situation from other constitutions and or other countries? And so that's sort of like a really broad one. Um, but with that one, you would be looking at sort of like, you know, the nation's identity, what makes us Americans, probably like after looking at the amendments and also the Constitution, a real emphasis on freedom might be like an element of national character. Possibly too, a sense of like individualism, which you might not find in other cultures and countries. So that's sort of another approach, looking at what is our identity, and then using that to understand the text. This one's a tricky one. There's only two more. Structuralism, which you and I have studied in the past. What
Hmm.
this one does is it basically looks at the Constitution in like its most important relationships in the text. So what patterns sort of exist within the text that everyone agrees on. So an example would be like the relationships among the three branches of the government, or the relationship between the federal and the state government, um, or the government and the people. All these are big structures that you find in the articles and the amendments. And so because you see those patterns there, those patterns then become sort of normative to understand other parts. So that's
Hmm.
sort of an interesting one. Another way, I don't know, another way of putting that, there are constitutional structures in the text. Um, there's also the structure of the document itself. So you're looking at those underlying common elements to understand the rest of it. And then the last one, which sounds like judicial precedent, are historical practices. But historical practices is broader than just the judiciary. It also covers um, all of the, or not all, but the decisions that have been made by all the political branches. So that would include legislative and also executive. So because, whatever, the Supreme Court has made these decisions, and we've seen laws passed in Congress, and we've seen a pattern or yeah, a pattern of decisions made in the executive, we can sort of pool those together to then understand the text. So I think all these are really interesting, especially when it comes to our discussion of the amendments. Well, I mean, obviously the Constitution itself, but the amendments,
Hmm.
because the question I always have is, which, I mean, not even just with constitutional talk, but really with any talk, especially when you're trying to understand a document, is which hermeneutic are you employing and why?
Hmm.
Because there's nothing about the document itself that sort of jumps off the page and says use me, right?
Right.
So um so yeah, I guess maybe as sort of like a quick question to you, understanding it, I just went over those quickly, and obviously you can go into those a little bit deeper. Which of those, either singly or coupled together, um, sort of makes sense to you as an appropriate mode of understanding the document?
Um, hmm.
And I know I'm just throwing that out at you. So,
Yeah.
you know,
I feel like I feel like there's not going to be one thing that you can do to
right.
to approach it.
Yeah,
I'm the kind of person who likes to attack something from every angle. So
sure.
if like understanding it through the lens of each of these
Hmm.
and then comparing those would make the most sense to me. I
Yeah,
don't think there's like a default, hey, oh, you got to go for originalism or
right,
pragmatism.
right,
Um,
right.
I mean, like you said, moral reasoning can kind of be used as a lens through all of them. So
Hmm.
maybe
Hmm.
that would be like one of the better ones to kind of meta-analyze the
Yeah.
approaches of analyzing it, you know?
And I actually think in a lot of our discussions, um, past discussions on the topic of politics and society, we're utilizing moral reasoning,
Yeah,
right? I mean, maybe we could just say straight up logic, but also a type of moral reasoning where we're questioning whether or not something is fair, um, or because politics itself sort of lends itself to ethical reasoning, right? I mean, everyone's making an ethical claim about what we ought to do. I mean, everyone, even
right.
Machiavelli,
Hmm.
that it sort of lends itself to um, a mode. It seems like it's almost unavoidable, you know.
Yeah,
Um, so yeah, we can revisit those as we talk about them.
sure. I
Just a
wrote them
little bit
down
of
so I can
good,
look
good,
back.
yeah. Just a little bit on the so the Bill of Rights is ratified 1791. Constitution was ratified in 1789. So there's a lot of debate after the Constitution as to whether or not there should be this separate Bill of Rights included
Hmm.
um, to or amended to the document. Um, there was a debate between these groups called the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists did not think that there needed to be a separate Bill of Rights. So they opposed this idea, basically because they thought it was unnecessary. Just to give you a quote
Hmm.
from Alexander Hamilton, one of the Federalists, he said, "The Constitution is itself, in every rational sense and to every useful purpose, a Bill of Rights." So the Federalist position was that this is already included in there. Hey, you got life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? All you need to do is tease those out individually to find out what the individual's rights are, right? So they opposed it. The Anti-Federalists, um, being somewhat afraid of a strong centralized government, they refused to support the Constitution without one. And their notion was that this is sort of interesting that if it's not spelled out, so in other words, their case was that the Constitution, by and large, was written in such a way that it tells us what the government can do, but it never tells us what the government really can't do. I mean, that might be a really strong statement, um, but right, because we might be able to finger through the Constitution and be like, oh, I don't know, this sounds like a not what they can't do.
Hmm.
But that was their sense. So it never really specifies what the government can't do. And tagged on to that is the idea that um, if you don't spell out individual personal rights, and we've read this before, Locke, Hobbes, to a degree, that if they're not spelled out, then that's an assumed power
Hmm.
by the sovereign.
Yep.
Okay, so by spelling them out, then that limits, if you will, the legislative or the branches in terms of what they could do to you or against you.
Yeah.
Spell it out, and then that particular right will be protected. So you've got this sort of like ongoing debate about it. My own sense is I'm probably a little bit more on the anti-federalist. In other words, why would we necessarily be a problem to clarify life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in a series of amendments? I
Wait,
don't, you know what I'm
why
saying?
would it be a problem?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem like it would be a
Yeah.
problem,
Okay.
right?
Hmm.
You know, so I think though, and we'll read about this over the next 2 weeks with the Federalists, that, and this is just my own sense, and I'm not sure if it's accurate, is that their idea was, we've got the Constitution, let's leave everything else up to state and local uh, governments,
Mm-hmm.
and also sort of the interaction of the citizens with their local and state governments to determine what it's going to look like in Maryland or what it's going to look like in Virginia,
Mm-hmm.
as it plays out. So that's my sense. But I don't know. It'll be interesting to read the actual arguments over the next 2 weeks to see if I'm missing something. You know.
Yeah.
But as it stands right now, it's sort of like I don't see a problem spelling things out a little bit more. And it's not like we've got. I mean, the Constitution's short. The amendments are short in terms of like reading material,
Yeah.
right? I mean, they're shorter than the stimulus bill that was just passed. I actually looked at it; it was like some 600 pages. So, you know what I'm saying? So, like,
Yeah.
I don't see this being cumbersome, but I'm open to hearing the other side.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think there's like I don't have a problem with it. I think it's better to list out everything and not leave it up to assumption.
Yeah,
Um,
especially the anti-federal. There's one really good quote here by Patrick Henry. He says, "For every possible right which is not reserved to the people by some express provision or compact is within the king's prerogative."
mhm.
And that seems, I mean, in terms of how you play out the whole social contract, right? I'm giving up some of my natural rights, or my rights from a state of nature, in order to establish this power, in order to create this protection. Well, you better spell it out. Otherwise, that power is, well, I mean, it could very well shift, right, to um, those in power. Um, I say that because it's interesting having said that, because one of the amendments actually addresses this. What is it? Oh, I think it's 9 and 10, where 9 and 10 basically go. Sorry, I'm actually flipping through a big book here. Yeah, 9 says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So that amendment's even sort of like addressing this issue of like, hey, if it's not specified, where is it?
Mhm.
And 10, the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So even there's this acknowledgement of it's a concern, right? It's a concern about what if it's not spelled out, like I don't know, like some right we haven't even thought about. I mean, let's say like the right to this is sort of trending right now, a right to housing, right,
Mhm.
or a right to a free education if someone were to pose that. Like certain rights we're just not thinking about um, today when they pop up in debate. Sort of where does that right shift? Is it a right? Is it not? So on and so forth. So I think it's um, the spelling it out seems to be important.
Yeah, definitely.
So on to the amendments.
Mhm.
Shall we start with the first one?
Sure.
So I'll read it and then you can dive into it because I've been doing a lot of talking. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So, what do you make of that
Yes.
amendment?
I mean, so it's got kind of threefold, um, what's the word? Promises or
Mm-hmm.
rights, I guess.
Yeah.
So there's
Mm-hmm.
the religion, the speech, and then the peaceably assembling to petition.
Sure.
Um, and I mean, they all make sense. They were not listed, these kinds of things were not listed in the original Constitution. So
Right.
it's important that they're brought up, and there's value in each of these things,
Hmm.
um, especially at that time and even now. Like
Yeah.
it's a huge deal.
Yeah.
Just considering like that, those are not considered freedoms in other countries,
Sure.
and that's something that
Precisely.
divides, America from them. So
Quite.
protecting those things.
Yeah. And I think it's like, I mean, this, it's, um, I think this like this reminds me. I mean, I go back to sort of like the sort of the state of nature, right? I'm
Yep.
able to do absolutely anything,
Hmm.
and then we enter the social contract, and I'm not able to do absolutely anything, but I should be able to have control over something that is, part of my either identity, let's say religion, right, or my um, sort of like ability to express myself, you know,
Hmm.
um, and and it's retained, right? I can say anything in a state of nature, um, and thankfully, I mean, I can't do anything in the United States, um, but thankfully, I this is one thing. Let's put it this way: it almost seems like it's a right of the right of sort of like express. A lot of this is expressing yourself, right?
Hmm.
So it's expressing yourself through religion. It's expressing yourself through speech. It seems like this is no change has been made, between the state of nature and this contract on this point. On this point, in other words, it's entirely retained,
Yeah.
which I think is pretty cool.
Hmm.
Um, I think the one thing though that we have to pose is as it relates to so obviously like and this First Amendment is so like beautifully American, as you were pointing out.
Hmm.
Not everyone has the freedom to sort of say what they want. Um, but with this, and this is maybe a good place to pose it because it'll be relevant not just to this amendment but also to others, is the question. And so here it is. Is it the case that no constitutional right is absolute? Can there be exception?
Hmm. Um, that's a question. Yeah. Okay. So I mean, it depends on what the exception is, and it
Sorry
depends
about
on
that.
if it's actually an exception, right?
Right,
Like this amendment lists restrictions, right? Like it
right,
says peaceably assemble, to
right.
petition. There's no, so there's something there's a non-peaceable way to assemble and to
Hmm.
petition. Um, there's let's see, respecting the establishment of religion, prohibiting free exercise thereof. Um, so and then uh, abridging. I'm not entirely sure the context of why that
Limiting, maybe. Right, an
limiting. Okay.
abridgment is yeah. An abridged text is a text that's been edited down.
Hmm.
So like a limiting of it.
Sure. The freedom of speech, and I think the word freedom of speech is is kind of similar to like the peaceably assemble,
Yeah.
right? So in the state of nature, there's you have the ability to speak, you have the ability to
Hmm.
assemble,
Hmm.
and to establish religion. Um, how you do that depends on how you do that. If you do that peaceably,
Right.
if you do that freely, then that's how you're doing it. You can do that
Right.
violently, and that's definitely very different, which seems to not be endorsed, by the Constitution. That's one of the, or this amendment. That's one of the
Yeah.
restrictions. So in that case, I don't know if that's an exception. It's just like one of the
Hmm.
limitations that's being put on it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I think so the amendments. I mean, not all of them, but this one is very universal.
yeah.
Its language is very universal, but its application is not going to be universal, right? They're going to be. you can say limits, or I can say exceptions to the rule, right? So, um, and this becomes interesting because as we move, obviously the Second Amendment is going to be very important to talk about as well, right?
Hmm.
Um, and and obviously all these amendments have some type of historical context that we might not be fully aware of as non-historians. But yeah, I mean, like the ability to, to express yourself in all these particular ways, I think is certainly to go back to um, the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness
Hmm.
is crucial, right? I mean, obviously, the liberty is there in terms of my ability to express myself, but I think a lot of it is about, um, uh, happiness as such, right? That I can do these particular things. I think the interesting thing comes when you start to come up with a particular um, controversies, right? But then challenge the meaning of the text. So
Hmm.
just to give you an example, like hate speech, right?
Yeah.
So you have hate speech. Um, well, if I am able to freely express myself, then I should be able to engage in racial slurs and ethnic jokes and whatever it might be, right?
Hmm.
Um, but then the question is, should that be limited based on this? One reading of the amendment would say, let people do it. We have to deal with the consequences. It's horrible, but we want to retain this freedom. Or is there something else, either in another amendment or the Constitution, that would say, well, wait a minute, we're free, but within limits. And beyond that limit, there are certain things that, certain modes of speech that we wouldn't allow.
Right.
So let's say hate speech being one of them. So it's sort of like how do you navigate that, right? I mean, hate speech is one. Let's
It's also
give you another.
ill-defined.
Sure, no, that's a very good point. Um, hate speech, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean,
Um,
if you're gonna have a limitation, you're gonna want to ask one, what is the limitation, and you're also going to want to ask why you want it to be a limitation.
hmm hmm
And in that, you need to make sure that it's well defined. Otherwise, you can't have laws around it.
right. Yeah. No, that's. I mean, I would basically say that it's public, right? So it's not private. It would be a public form of speech. You're expressing hate or encouraging violence.
Those are two different
Uh,
things.
what's that?
Those are two different things.
Yeah. Yes. Um, and you're doing it against, let's say, a particular group, right?
Hmm.
Um, so, I mean, I guess what I would ask you, would you want to limit that? And if you do limit that, then what's lost or what's gained for that matter?
I mean, the answer is probably twofold. It's like yes and no.
Hmm
um, and I think in a sense, some of it is already limited. Like inciting violence is not endorsed in
Right.
freedom of speech, and there's laws against inciting violence
Yeah.
already.
Right.
I don't know if that's at the state level or where that exists, but
Sure.
that's definitely a limitation that already exists, and
hmm
that is different from hate because inciting violence is a call to action, whereas hate is like an
Right.
opinion. So
Sure.
those are one of those has a real effect on people. The other
hmm
one is an opinion that someone has, and it might affect their feelings,
hmm
which is different from something that could actually harm someone, physically.
Right. Yeah.
Now, yeah, it is a question. It's like, do you want, is it worth trying to specify the definition of hate speech? Is it worth um, going down that route and seeing if that is actually beneficial or if you can
hmm
quantify it and the consequences of it.
Right.
Um, but I don't think that there's a.
Well, let me give you a specific example and
Mhm.
then see how you respond to it. So I know that in France, they have made it illegal to deny the Holocaust. That's very specific.
Mhm.
So And there might be other sort of anti-Semitic things tagged onto that you can't express. So what's gained, what's lost there with
Um,
that law? And by the way, I don't know what the penalty is, but I do know that denying the Holocaust in France is illegal.
okay, so what's lost? People can no longer say certain phrases.
Hmm.
Who knows what those
And I guess,
phrases are?
and I mean, we know what's gained, right? I mean, what's gained is going to be real recognition of a travesty of the past and all of its horrors, and a recognition of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and then what's lost is obviously, yeah, whatever. A certain percentage of the population is not able to express themselves freely on this topic.
Or to
But
make
but
jokes, but that's another
yeah,
question.
sure. But the sort of the issue is, um, I mean, there's part of me with that particular law, there's part of me that wishes it wasn't a law, that um, that I guess the wish would be that all of us are working on ourselves both morally and rationally, and we would realize that sort of the facts are in,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore, and also saying such things is going to have a negative effect on some part of the population. So you own it.
It's karma.
Yeah, right. You own it yourself without um, being compelled by a law.
Yeah.
The flip side is that, does it just clean up something entirely because there is that law? You know what I'm saying? In other
Yeah.
words, you're going to be less likely to do that. And also, too, what's interesting about the law is that, and maybe this is sort of a subtle, underlying element, is that it then says, as a state, we are recognizing, or as a country, we are recognizing the horrors of the Holocaust. I think that's embedded in there,
Sure.
right? We are saying that it was real. Um, but the part that, the part that's sort of like, I mean, it's the same thing with sort of like, lying in the media or a lying politician. It's you've um, and let's say things can be fact checked, right,
Mm-hmm.
on both of those fronts. That it would be the same argument. My wish is that people would be, morally and rationally developed such that they wouldn't even engage in that rhetoric, um, and that you wouldn't have to have a law that goes in there to cut off that talk. You know,
Right.
um, but
So, I mean, we're talking about moral, right, at this point. And I think one question you have to ask is it moral to, um, what's the reason behind the punishment? Why does it need to be punished?
right, right.
Um,
Well, I think part of it is that I remember reading years ago. It was just a very sort of like pithy definition of law, and it's basically that law is all about limitations.
mm-hmm.
Now one could argue that that some laws are a limitation. It's a limitation on someone. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I think that's fair. So it limits you from doing something that, and sort of the flip side of that is that a limit can actually create a freedom, right?
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, in other words, by whatever, by limiting my ability to murder you, I am creating also, or I'm sorry, in that situation, it's creating a freedom for you to live,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the, the to go back to your question, then it creates a limit.
Yes.
It's basically saying you cannot engage in this behavior. Now, granted, um, you know, uh, your point about like sort of the consequences or a penalty. Um, I don't know. I guess there's two different approaches there. One would be that someone's going to look at the law, respect it, and and therefore there's a limit placed on their speech as it relates to that topic.
Mm-hmm.
No consequences, and then there would just be people who will flout it, and then they do have these, a particular consequence. I mean, the consequence obviously is always to or the penalty is obviously always to dissuade you from doing it, right?
Yeah. So here's
Um,
another thing. I think one of the greater fears is not that would be a law. It's more the to what extent does the government have power to, you know, have similar
meddle with it.
laws, right?
Oh yeah,
Or
sure,
yeah,
sure.
like so, if they have a law about not denying the Holocaust, then okay, how did that law come to be, first of all?
Hmm.
Second of
Hmm.
all, what is the process for other laws coming to be in a similar manner,
Hmm.
or restricting other language, right?
Hmm.
Like, could there be a law that says that goes against conspiracies, like, oh, the moon landing happened, like people who think the moon landing didn't
Sure.
happen, it's like, oh, now you can't talk about that. Like,
Yeah.
what is the
Yeah.
justification for having the
Hmm.
law in the first place? I think that's
Yeah.
more important than, well, I mean, the
No, I
fact,
think you're
yeah,
right. I think that so. I mean, obviously, this is going to be dealing with a ethnic group, and
yeah,
an ethnic group that, whatever, let's say has a relatively large presence. But I don't even think that that's too relevant. It could be a minority within the country, right?
hmm,
Um, but you have an ethnic group. That ethnic group is, this might not be the right word, but let's say like verbally assaulted slash verbally offended by said comments, and also too, there's a question of, like, I mean, to go back to life, liberty, and happiness. These comments, then, I understand it's France, but if it was proposed in the United States, these comments at some level are an infringement on someone's life, liberty, and happiness, and actually possibly their life, if it's encouraged, right, or
hmm,
if it's allowed. So you can, I feel like you can. Whereas the moon landing, who's it affecting? Like a few astronauts are going to laugh their asses off at you because they're scientists and they know they were there.
hmm,
It's not like a heavily oppressed group. Um, so, and also too, I would add to that, with this particular ethnic group, there's centuries long anti-Semitism. So you could look at it as the country is actually not just trying to protect the individuals, the Jewish individuals in France, but other things happen as well. You are sending a message to other countries, you
hmm,
and it's a way, maybe small, of hacking away at that centuries long stereotype.
hmm,
You I mean, I think those are the gains, but I'm still, you know, I still go back to that. I wish each individual was just willing it themselves.
yeah. I mean, there are other weird consequences, like in France, do they filter Google searches that have those
Yeah,
words in them? Like, does that
exactly.
mean that
No, all
there's
of that.
limitation
Hmm.
of observing things? That's not even just speech, that's
Hmm.
just like seeing what's out there.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and I can't comment on that, but you're right. There's a sort of interconnected matrix of other issues
yeah.
related to, that particular law. Um, but I think I mean, we'd have to see specific, well, specifically as it relates to hate speech, what laws are on the books, either at the federal or state level. I mean, if they're on the books, then they're, at least for the time, considered constitutional, right?
Hmm,
And um, and then you'd wrap that into the First Amendment, right? In other words, you would end up saying, to use sort of the judicial precedent, and or the what was the other one, the historical practices. Then you wrap that into the amendment, right?
hmm,
And say, uh, okay, here we have one big limitation, and we recognize, one, there is a limitation, and two, then we can start to tease out, would, to play the logic out, would there be any other limitations on other analogous types of speech,
hmm,
right? Um, and I think this is going to happen with all of them. Well,
yeah.
maybe not all of them. Maybe not the boring ones and the vice presidents and stuff. but something where you have like a universal declaration in the amendment,
Hmm.
and then you start to think of problem areas or the gray areas, and if they're, you know, um, yeah, if they're admitted, then we're like, okay, we've got this limit, and what else is limited, or what else could be, you know.
Yeah.
I think it's easy to do the other side, which is what should be free, right?
Well,
And
you don't
usually,
even need to iterate. You can't iterate
yeah,
what should be free because,
exactly,
yeah.
it's free, right?
Hmm.
But also in terms of its moral component, right? A compliment, praise, um, uh, you know, whatever, assemblies, and even sort of like, religious practices that might seem weird to some, but at the same point are not harming anyone. I think the harming element is the big one.
Yeah,
I
and
think the you know
yeah, and I think I don't know where I've heard this or where it came up, but like, excuse me. I feel like I remember something about religious practices that involved harm to some degree,
yeah,
and there's like there's a conflict of interest there
sure,
where it goes against other basic human rights. So
yeah,
it's not
yeah,
allowed. It's not respecting the law in other
sure.
regards. So in that sense, it is limited as well.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've been torn during COVID about the shutdowns, right?
Yeah.
And this is relevant in terms of the right to assemble.
Hmm.
But I mean, I'm torn in the sense that you know all of these religious buildings are shut down, and religion means a lot to the practitioners of it.
Hmm.
And but the flip side is it creating, I don't know, allowing assembly at this time, would it actually create some type of harm? This would be like the pragmatist in me,
Hmm.
to employ that mode. What is, yeah, so there's this desire to assemble. I understand that, but we're in sort of a new situation right now, with a pandemic, and it seems that the science is in, this is airborne, so on and
Yeah.
so forth. We should create our distances. So it's
Well,
sort of like, I mean,
you have the question of whose job is it to protect that harm too. It's like
yeah,
if it's consensual between the people that are gathering, then why is there a problem? Like if they understand the risks and the
yeah,
consequences, why
yeah,
is there a problem?
yeah, yeah,
So, is it the government's job to do that? Like if
yeah,
they're on private property, is that fine?
yeah,
Those
yeah.
are the questions that would be important.
No, you're absolutely right. Um,
Like it makes sense
and
that the
that, and
government has power to restrict public property where people publicly gather
yeah,
because there is that harm and there is that risk and not
yeah,
everyone is, you
yeah.
know,
But guys,
consensual in that regard.
it has public ramifications beyond the private. Meaning, in other words, if you had a super spreader event at a religious gathering, that it could spill over into the public as those people are infected and then going about their day-to-day business, interacting with other people
Yeah.
who weren't even part of that assembly, right?
Hmm.
So that, like, I get you on the private, right? It's private property. It's everyone's aware of the risks, and they're assembling, you
Hmm.
but then there's a question of, yeah, but they enter the public, and some of them might even be entering public, like, governmental buildings.
Right, but I
That's
mean,
that,
then you'd want, and in that case, you'd want to have the restrictions in the public by the government,
right.
and that should technically resolve the issues. Um,
Meaning, in other words, like, I went to church, there were 100 people there, we all had masks, we were all socially distanced. However, I could be infected, and you're telling your boss because you work at the tax department, right? Something like that. Like, you
well,
make them aware of. I'm just teasing out the details.
sure. I mean,
You make them
already, if
aware.
you like, I've gone to multiple dentist and doctor appointments recently, and they always ask, "Have you been in contact with other
Right,
people who have
right,
it in the last 14 days?" and all these
right.
questions. So if all of the public buildings are doing that,
Hmm.
then that should be their safeguard.
Right.
to
Right.
prevent it in their area, or even if private institutions are doing that, that should be their safeguard for in their area. And like I
Hmm.
went to the dentist the other day, and it's like there's a sign that says you're at your own risk coming here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's about understanding the context of the situation and not being an idiot.
Right. Right. Well,
Um,
exactly.
but people are going to be
Exactly.
idiots, so that's like
That's
that's
right.
fine. But they should be the ones suffering the consequences, not others. And
Yeah. Yeah.
um, if there are restrictions about gathering in public places, then they should receive consequences for that if they're not abiding to whatever is in place.
Yeah. And I think that's where, like, when you said they're being idiots, or not to be an idiot, I think that's maybe also where sort of law plays a role, right? Because you can't assume that everyone is going to be, as we said earlier, working on themselves morally and rationally, and trying to gather all the facts of a particular issue
Yeah.
and act accordingly.
And
You know,
it's yeah, and
the,
it's not
the
necessarily the
people,
law's job to
even even with the law, people are still going to be burglars.
yeah, yep.
You know.
It's not the law's
Um,
job to make people cognizant of all the issues and
yeah,
be smart about and
yeah.
be wise. I should say, but it is the law's job to protect other people from um, the
The idiots.
the idiots. Yeah, to a degree. Yeah, depending on the situation. Yes.
Let's look at the Second Amendment,
Yeah, because I'm
right?
sure we're gonna touch back on all of these when we get to the Federalist arguments. So
Yeah,
that'll be
exactly.
good.
So a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, I think what's really interesting about this one, as I said before, that all of these have sort of a historical halo. They're not right. They're not out of the blue, right?
Yep.
They're written for a reason. I do think this one. I think some lend themselves to a history more than others. And when I say that, I mean even by the language that's employed. So where the First Amendment clearly is, it clearly does have a historical context where it's where whatever the early colonialists did not feel free to do these things
Hmm.
under the Roman or the Roman the British Crown. Um, Nonetheless, they're these big, massive universal statements, and I feel like they could apply wherever you have a Congress, a government, speech, press. Right? It's very broad.
Hmm.
But the Second Amendment is really interesting because it starts out talking about a well-regulated militia, and when you and I talk about the military, we do not talk about a militia, right? We
Hmm.
talk about a military and the branches of the military. Um, yes, there's a federal form of it. Yes, there's a state form of it, um, in terms of like the National Guard. But militia is, I feel like, heavily laden with historical meaning, right? At this time, there is no uh, well, I guess they're starting a federal military with the Constitution, right? But in terms of this particular amendment, the you basically seemingly have uh, common citizens that make up the militia if in fact it needs to be called forth,
Right.
right? Um, so my point in raising this here is that the the originalist textualist approach uh, might be wanting, or the originalist textualist approach might really help clarify what the amendment, the limitations of the amendment, right?
Hmm.
Meaning, in other words, like, so the one approach is, like, if you're just going with the textualist or the originalist, one approach might be, hey, this was about a militia, and the militia meant something in the 18th century that it does not mean now.
Hmm.
Um, So the question would be, can we just fit in federal military into the word militia? Or do we have to understand that this was a sort of temporary arrangement, or well, not temporary, it was an arrangement that is now defunct, of militias being made up of common citizenry as opposed to professional soldiers who are trained and paid as professional soldiers. I feel
Mm-hmm.
like that, you with me? Like that's key, because everything that comes after it is somewhat connected to that militia notion. And my sense of the application of the Second Amendment, um, whatever, especially that are those that are very pro guns, etc., are, I feel like it misses this piece, this historical piece.
Sure.
Meaning, in other words, it. I guess another way to like, is the Second Amendment um, really just, or not just? I'm sorry. Along with whatever else it's doing, is it protecting an individual's right to have arms for self-defense, or even to just bear arms? Like, is that what the Second Amendment is about, or are these historical factors in there that could lead to either, hey, we input military or federal military instead of militia, or hey, militias, we just don't have them anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it is important to consider whether or not the term is relevant or the concept is relevant, um,
Right.
and whether or not this is talking about two things.
Sure. No, you're right, because it is a regulated militia necessary to the security of the free state, the right of the people, right? It sounds
Mm-hmm.
like we're starting another, related but another topic, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Um, so you're right. There is this sort of this question about um, how many things are going on
Yeah.
in this document or
Mm-hmm.
this amendment.
Yeah, I would definitely be curious to see the when we. I'm assuming these each of these amendments are written about in the next documents we'll be reading, like the arguments for them.
Yeah, uh, I'm wondering. I'm not sure.
Okay,
I'm not sure.
because I
But
was hoping
but
we can get some more context on some of
yeah,
these.
no, I'm with you. But I feel like with this one, like, in other words, the I mean, you have a couple issues. One is this is the militia and the people keeping and bearing arms connected? Okay, and again, you have my two different interpretations there. The militias are now defunct. Does that affect the latter part of this amendment, or is this, if you put in uh, uh, federal military,
Mm-hmm.
then guess what? Then that limits what it means by people, right?
Yeah.
If they're connected, that would mean soldiers, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to just anyone. Um,
Or like, is the well regulated the only part that's different? Um, like, is a militia still necessary for the security of a free state, but we
mhm,
don't have well regulated ones?
mhm, mhm.
Like, is the that idea now just that the um, people can still form one? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I know that. I mean, there has been sort of militia talk, on the news in terms of small groups sort of like seeing themselves as a type of citizen militia, right?
Yeah, and like, is that supposed to be run by the state? Is that what's implied here? Or is that just by the people?
Well, what's interesting here is that you'd have to then go back to sort of the Constitution and whatever they talk about in terms of military, right?
Yeah.
Is it the case that we would sort of connect to those two, as opposed to, I mean, it seems that, I mean, I, I don't know if Federalists or well, how the Federalists or Anti-Federalists would answer this question, but if it is under the aegis of the state, it seems like you don't have a problem. But if it's not, if it's open to under the aegis of the state and or just a militia that gets formed, then you start to get some issues. In other
Mm-hmm.
words, like if it's a freewheeling autonomous militia, I feel like you can enumerate a number of problems there.
Yeah,
At the
definitely.
same point, to play it out and to go back to Locke, if you do have, or and to go back to the Declaration of Independence,
Mm-hmm.
if you do have a corrupt government, well, who is going to
Yeah.
combat it, right? So it, possibly a citizenry militia,
Yeah.
because
Mm-hmm.
the military will be under the rule of the state. The other historical element here, I think, is interesting as well, is um, if you do sort of originalist textualist, um, you have uh, yeah, whatever, the right of the people to keep and bear arms. So let's just say it's the right of the citizens, just for sake of argument.
Yeah.
Now you come up with another issue of sort of, you know, sort of like weapon technology and its development.
Yeah.
So you've got muskets, and sort of these old school sort of, weapons versus like assault rifles, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, is it guns or sorry, arms generally? And to go back to the First Amendment, what are the limitations? Or is it, you know, um, does the assault weapon, example create so much, potential problems that you can then put a limit on what arms means,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like for instance, from what I know, I can't just buy a tank. I mean, maybe I can and keep it on my private property, maybe, um, or military grade like missile launchers or something like that. I'm
Right.
guessing I can't buy that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that is a
Or
type
build
of
it.
right. That is a type of weapon. It is a type of arms. Um, so, so that's another one that I have as well. Even if you allow the right and you don't limit it to a militia context, uh, are there limits? You
Yeah.
know,
No, that's definitely
I,
very important because it's
yeah.
like when what this would be originalism or historical something like
So the textualism is plain text, no intention.
right.
Originalism is intention.
So
Is
if you take, I think the originalism, or the pragmatic, if you take the originalism view, then you say, okay, um, in that context, that was the definition of militia. That was the
yeah,
definition of arms.
arms.
And
Yeah,
then you're like, okay, what has changed between then and now?
yeah,
And does one, has the definition changed? Two, has the context changed? And then three, it's like, does the rule need to change? Does the amendment
right,
need to change to
right,
accommodate the changes in the definitions or the context?
right.
And that's probably, I feel like that's a good way to go. I feel like that's generally a good way to approach most of the amendments.
Hmm, hmm.
It's not like it's not prescriptive in any way. It's just purely observing the differences, and then you can
Yeah,
judge those accordingly.
yeah. No, I think there's something there, but I can see why. I mean, not just because I want to own my gun or I want to, uh, ban all guns, but I can see, right? I can see like why it's a contentious amendment, even in its wording,
Yeah.
right? Um,
So one
uh,
other further question or further
mhm.
thing is like the going what was the purpose? Is this still originalism? The intent?
Originalism deals with intent, so how
Yeah.
the framers
So
were, what they were actually thinking,
so
not
if
just what they
if
wrote.
if what they were thinking was they want the people and the militia to be able to protect the state, to keep it free,
Hmm,
then they're probably thinking that it's an equal, somewhat of an equal playing field in the arms between the state and its militia and the federal government, or
hmm.
something along that lines. Like it's able to protect and secure the state itself.
Yeah.
So if you were to take modern technology and weapons, is that still an equal playing field, or is it fair if it's not an equal playing field of what arms can be bared in the
Hmm,
state versus
hmm,
what the government has access to, and should the government have access to those things?
hmm.
Um, and it's very, I mean, it's a complicated issue because there's just so much more. Like the government's bigger, we has a bigger military now. That's a big backing to a lot
Sure.
of what our country is, and it's kind of required to keep us in. equilibrium with the other surrounding countries. So it's a complicated matter as to like, does that still apply, and what is it still important to that degree?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm thinking here too of the Third Amendment
Mm-hmm.
about no quartering, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that is so like I mean, I'm of two minds on this. One, it's sort of like from my reading, apparently it's actually never reached the Supreme Court in a particular case. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, so what's interesting here is that, but I want to be careful. Like, if it wasn't there, maybe we would have more quartering, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's fair. But at the flip side is it seems so historically rooted to what was going on in the 1700s and the late 1700s that its relevancy to us today is is thin,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, granted, if it wasn't there, you know, is there another part of the Constitution that would correct for it? I don't know. But my point in raising that is that it has sort of the historical flavor in a similar way, not just because it deals with soldiers, but it has the historical flavor of that the Second Amendment has, where there's a lot going on in their world at their time where the amendment seems very relevant
Yeah.
um, for the as again going back to the first, which has this sort of categorical quality. Um, yes, there's a historical element, but the other two just seem very worded that way. Or even like prohibition, right? The 18th that was ultimately overturned.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not. I mean, it had its time and its place. It was overturned, due to whatever, senators and representatives wanting to have their drink again, whatever the reason was.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so so it's interesting. Um, whatever, even like I mentioned, the ninth and the 10th, which basically deal with, hey, those rights not stipulated are still, held by the people or the states. Very general quality to it that it's hard to sort of be like, what's the relevance of this?
Yeah.
And does its history actually show us the relevance? And is it still relevant?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my own sense with the I just feel like it's hard to avoid the pragmatic element, especially on the Second Amendment, especially as it relates to assault rifles, mass shootings, so
Mm-hmm.
on and so on. Just it's I just
Yeah.
like what what's retained on including assault style weapons within that, even if you're allowing the right to exist, right,
Right.
for people to bear arms. It's very difficult. I mean, and I admit I'm not a big gun person. I don't have a weapon, so if you were having this conversation with court, would it be different?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas he's very pro NRA and weapons, etc.
Right.
Um, and I want to admit as well that it's unfortunate. I mean, let's put it this way: in a utopia, then everyone could have whatever weapon they wanted, and if they wanted to use rocket launchers for target practice, great.
Yeah.
It's just it is the few bad apples that are maybe messing it up for the guy that wants to collect a bunch of assault style weapons, but is still being a law abiding citizen.
Yeah.
So I
Mm-hmm.
recognize that part. You know,
Yeah. And I know it's like
yeah,
getting a bit
I know.
late, but we could probably talk about any of these amendments for an entire session.
It's crazy. I knew we
And
would
like,
not be able to
yeah,
jump on
and
all
like
26.
analyze. It would be very cool, maybe in the future, to
Yeah.
kind of take these or some of the most controversial
Mhm.
ones and kind of just analyze them from all of these perspectives,
Totally.
and just see what comes of it.
Yeah.
Um, I guess we should probably highlight some of the other amendments before we wrap up.
No doubt.
One
No
thing I
doubt. Go
wanted
for
to
it.
mention that isn't very controversial, and I don't think it's really controversial, but it's just kind of a weird thing. Um, we on the elections, like the electors and the president and vice president,
Hmm.
how prior, it was the same election and the person who got second was enlisted as the vice president.
Yeah.
And then the amendment allows for two separate elections basically to happen,
Hmm.
two
Hmm.
separate listings.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me is that when we vote now, they're paired together.
Yeah.
But as it's
exactly.
listed in the amendments, it's not like they're two separate races,
You're
um,
absolutely right.
which
The
is
person
kind of
having the
weird.
greatest, the person having the greatest number of votes as vice president
Yeah,
shall be the vice president.
yeah. Why don't we
Yeah.
do that?
I am
Where did
not
that go?
sure. I am not sure that I remember reading that and I was like, shouldn't this read like how we do
Yeah,
elections, you know?
exactly.
Um, and I am not exactly sure.
Part of the reason I bring this up is because I probably talked to you about this a while ago. There is
You
this the idea of Unity 2020.
yep, you did.
Yeah, where basically they are elected, as kind of separate, and one is
Hmm.
from the left leaning, one is from center right leaning, and they would be more joint in their role. That was the idea of that. So it just came to mind because I was like, wait, this looks
This
like
sounds like
how
that
it's
idea.
written. Yeah. So why do we do it differently? And maybe that's a state thing. I don't know. I just thought I'd
Hmm.
bring that up. What else
Yeah.
do we want to touch on?
Oh, I mean, obviously, key ones like the 13th Amendment, very important, right?
Yes.
Banning slavery
Yep.
of all sorts. That's a crucial one,
Hmm.
um, and uh, and a big step on the way to civil rights. I think this will also be relevant, that this move was made and that we have this history with African Americans in the United States will be
Hmm.
relevant when we come to the identity politics bit.
Yes.
Um, 14 is crucial as well in terms of the equal rights element. It's section one, I think, is the biggest part. All persons born or naturalized in the United
Hmm.
States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property, or due process. So I know that this helped with the recognition of women as well. Um,
As they were citizens because they were persons born and naturalized.
exactly,
Yes.
exactly. So
Hmm.
I know that that's a huge one. I do think what's interesting, I think it is with the 14th that the notion of person gets expanded to corporations,
Oh, where
because a
is that?
corporation, no, it's not in it.
Oh, oh.
It's the application of the law, where a corporation is considered a legal person,
Hmm.
and it got so it wasn't just like flesh and blood human citizen, but it got sort of extended. The notion of personhood got sort of extended to include the rights, as it were, that a corporation has. People on the right have no problem with this. People on the left, sometimes.
Oh, you cut out. Are you still there? Probably had no alarm.
Hello.
Yeah, sorry, you cut out.
Yeah, there's always one interruption. It's sometimes my alarms go off.
Yeah,
It
I figured.
triggers the phone. So, but yes, no, there's a lot to discuss. The Federalist Papers obviously will get us more into this whole question of states' rights versus federal rights, the relationship between those two levels of government,
Hmm.
and revisit the question of the amendments.
Yeah.
Um,
One other thing, since we were talking about the 13th and 14th Amendment, it looks like it took three amendments to kind of get fully. I don't how I need to guard my words. I think fully, um, equal between at least races, right? Because the
mhm,
first one, the 13th is about slavery. The 14th
right,
expands on personhood and who's
right,
naturalization, and then the 15th actually says that is regarding voting and
sure.
race, color, previous condition of
Hmm.
servitude. So it took three, and over a course of what? Just between those amendments, it looks like 5 years.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
of course, there's a huge history before that of
Hmm.
conflict.
No, it's important.
Yeah.
right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, in terms of like this is the whole issue with the treatment of African Americans is, um, I mean, it's long in the United States. It is ugly in so many ways, and and it still bears itself out as we know in 2020 and to the present, in in other ways. So you know it's it's important that the legislation was done. It's important that those rights were granted. It still seems like there's a lot of work to do,
Yeah.
you know.
Maybe.
But
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of the legal, rights-based things are at least in the law, right? There's
hmm
definitely other things that are issues as a society.
well, and the beauty too of it, as it were, and I'll credit the Constitution on it, is hey, you said life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness,
Mm-hmm.
and that this should be a granted human right. So the beauty of the document is that you can use the document, as it were, I don't want to say against itself, but to tease out any inconsistencies in the real world,
Mm-hmm.
that need to be teased out, and and that's what a lot of people pointed back to as in terms of rights for African Americans and rights for women. You can't deny their humanity.
Yeah.
All right, on to the Federalist Papers next week.
Yeah. Okay. I will stop recording.